Hello, everybody. My name is Beth Fisher-Yoshida, and I am a professor of practice and program director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program. It's a master's program at Columbia University in the city of New York. And I'm super excited today to have my colleagues, Rick Spann and Simon Martin, who will be talking about their book, ReSounding, Introducing an Alternative Metaphor for Organization Change. And as we know, change management, change transformation can be rather challenging, especially in an organizational context. And I'm going to let them say a little bit more about themselves and also about their thinking behind the book, and then wherever our conversation takes us. So I'll turn it over to you now, Rick and Simon. Please say a little bit about yourselves and your thinking behind the creation of this wonderful book.
Well, Simon, why don't you start?
I was about to ask the same thing of you. My name's Simon Martin. I'm based near Oxford in the United Kingdom. Used to live in Berlin in Germany, which is where Rick and I first met. So that's perhaps where the story began, but we'll not go there first. I'm an organizational consultant, spend a lot of time working practically with organizations around their different challenges. And the book really was born out of a series of conversations that Rick and I have had over the years, sharing our viewpoints, frustrations almost on the ways that we've worked in organizations in the past, and finding that certain dominant modes of thinking and dominant perspectives are still prevalent, and perhaps sharing a desire to loosen those up a little bit and play a little bit around the edges and think of ways of developing new perspectives on our work with organizations, however broadly or narrowly you define that.
Well, and I'm Rick. I'm living in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And yes, Simon and me met in Berlin on a workshop on improv. We might talk about that a little bit because that's closely connected to our work, improvisation in all its complexities. I'm also working as an organizational consultant, which is a bit of a second career because the first career is around music. I'm a musicologist and musician, and I'm worked as a journalist, as a sound engineer, as a teacher, as a band coach, all kind of things around music and art and theater and stuff. And then bringing that into lessons from that world into the world of organizational change, because there are very, very interesting parallels. And the work that Simon and me started to do was about trying to come up with a metaphor that is offering, well, different options for change, a different metaphor that we could play with to navigate the complexity of our organizations and of our lives.
Yes, so for those of you interested, we did include in the chat a link to the cmminstitute.org. And there, if you search around a little bit, you'll see that I did write a book review for the book. So I do know the book. I don't know it as well as you two know the book, but I do know that music is such a strong metaphor. It's such a strong theme as you go throughout the book. So it seems also playful, right? In a very playful way, because like I said before, change can be very challenging. So a little bit more about how you use the theme and the metaphor of music to go through the different phases of org change in the book.
I am taken in my mind, and Rick, do jump in here, back to where we first met, which was linked to music really. It was this improvisation workshop that Rick mentioned, and it was in a yoga studio on the banks of the Spree in Berlin with Stephen Nachmanovich, who's a great thinker around all types of improvisation. And the invitation, and it was an invitation, was to sort of sign up for something that was a bit uncertain and unclear. And we were asked to bring musical instruments if we had them, but we're told we won't be able to play them in the ways that we would normally play them. And that was obviously enough to get both Rick and I there in the first place. So kind of music was there from the off, really, thinking of using musical instruments as ways of demonstrating gesture and response in organization. So in many ways we were creating off the cuff pieces of music with just our voices or banging on tables and things, and they were temporary organizations in a way. So that's kind of what got us together. And then our conversations continued sort of a bit more whimsically with this idea, and I honestly forget how we came up with it, Rick, it was probably you, of taking the work of another organizational thinker, Gregory Bateson, and putting it together really next to Miles Davis's seminal album, Kind of Blue, and being curious about what links that there might be between the two, or what ideas that might spark. So it's sort of a metaphorical process which had sort of music at its heart. And I think sort of Bateson was a bit of a guiding figure behind some of our initial experiments, in the sense that he worked very widely across different fields and disciplines and never really wanted to belong in any of them, even though people were quite keen that he did belong. But he seems to have managed to have resisted that, and really worked very fruitfully in the edges and in the links between different areas. I've kind of moved slightly away from your original question, but with music and sound, we also realized, coming back to this idea of, you know, what is the dominant way that we think in organizations, we noticed that there are metaphors that abound, like the machine metaphor that's been quite heavily researched and written about. But we also noticed that visual images are very strong in our language and in the ways that we think in organizations. And we just got curious, what happens if we play with an aural image, a tonal image? So this idea of sound as a way of thinking about organization became a jumping off point, really, for some conversations that eventually led to writing some of these things down.
Yeah.
I'd rather jumped in there, Rick. Do you?
Yeah. Building on that, Bateson's way of working, which is more like a transdisciplinary approach, above, on a meta level, above all the different silos that we might have in our thinking and in our institutions, connects deeply to the essence of music as I learned it as a musicologist, which is about, we talk about that in the book as the harmony of the spheres, like interconnectedness, like patterns, like transformational change, like all kind of ideas that actually are really close to what's happening in complexity science or in systems thinking. All these things are really connected. So music in itself is an overarching metaphor for the way that you can engage in all kinds of looking at different situations and trying to perceive it from a different angle from the world of music. So it's sometimes I just try to explain this by saying it's not only about the metaphor of jamming, like in jazz, but it's also jamming with metaphors. Like you have different paradigms, but it's not like a paradigm shift only, it might be paradigm hopping, being in a situation where you can really sense the world from a different perspective, which opens up, as we call it, more energy and more options for change.
Yeah, very nice. And I know that in my own work in organizations, that as soon as you go into an organizational context, and if you just are a little bit observant, you'll notice that every organization has its own rhythm, right? There are different rhythms, ways of movement, way things happen. When you understand the processes and procedures that take place, the structures, there is a certain rhythm. The other thing I noticed in your book, which I really enjoyed, was that at the beginning of each chapter, you made a recommendation as to the music that people could listen to while they're reading. And I diligently did that because I wanted to be in the space you recommended mentally, right? And physically in all ways. And so how did that come about, that you thought about, well, you know what, if we're using music as a metaphor, let's just make some recommendations on some great music for people to listen to?
One of Bateson's favorite, one of the things he said was, let's stamp out all the nouns. So the words, stuff that solidifies things or turns it into something which is not lifelike anymore. And music, what is happening inside of music, when you put it into text or into words, you take something away from it. Or as moving it to the metaphor of dance, like Isadora Duncan, being quoted by Gregory Bateson, said the point of dance is in the dancing. If I could explain it in words, I wouldn't have to dance it. So offering, and I'm really glad that you really are as obedient and diligent as I know you, that you really were doing that, because they were carefully selected, these sections, because what is underneath in the blue notes, in the cracks of the text, that is in the different compositions that are selected. So Maiden Voyage, it's about harmonies, it's about, so they're connected, so it opens up a more like a multi-sensory experience of what we're trying to develop.
Right. I think it's sort of, it's trying to find routes to freeing up thinking and new approaches, because we all do it, and it's kind of comfortable to slot into a particular paradigm or a way of thinking about things, and even those of us who are aware of these things get stuck. And yeah, music is perhaps just another route in, different portal into the brain or something that kind of helps you perhaps into a different way of thinking about things. And I know sort of we wandered all over the place in the book making connections. It's an experiment in making connections in many ways, and we noticed that sort of that the heard over the visual is something that could be emphasized to effect, but also the sort of the felt and the embodied. I mean, you talked about the dancing there, Rick. That's kind of where we ended up towards the end of the book, is getting interested in what's an embodied metaphor of organizational change, and how might we explore that, and realizing that there's an awful lot we didn't know about that, and we're quite interested in connecting with people and finding out about, really.
Yeah, so it's like sense making and using the senses for sense making, and Carl Weick's work in sense making. So I'm not to put you on the spot, but can you give an example of something that you've experienced in an organization where you thought this could really address those kind of issues to take people, like you said, freeing up their thinking? So they're not because when we think in the same way, then we end up in the same place. There's nothing new and innovative. So can you think of anything in your work from an organizational context where you think this kind of freeing up of the thinking could really work well in addressing those kind of concerns or issues?
Yeah, I mean, many situations. First that comes to mind is sort of a transformation context. I mean, that's a big word that we hear a lot in organizations. But I mean, you mentioned it yourself, Beth. When you go into an organization and you listen to the language and notice the behaviors, you start to sort of notice stuff that comes up again and again. And often that can be a clue to perhaps underlying metaphors or ways of thinking about the job in hand. So it can be quite interesting to listen into a group of people maybe who are charged with steering a transformation and see the pace of their speech, but also the words that they choose. Is there a clue to how they're thinking about the nature of this change that's needed in an organization? And then what can be particularly interesting is to notice if there are differences in the way that people are talking about it, because it suggests that people might have a different image of what needs to be done in their heads. And if that's not explored and surfaced and aligned in some way, then it can lead to sort of frustrations and tensions and misunderstandings, even within a small transformation team, which ripple out throughout the wider change. So you're using it as a route in to kind of think about what are some of these underlying assumptions that we're making about the change. Is it all about pace and speed and pain, or avoidance of pain? Or is it more about nurture, perhaps with a bit more of a steady cadence or rhythm, to go back to that music metaphor? And which does it need to be, and where can we meet in the middle and agree? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you can build on that around what comes to mind with rhythm, building on what you both were talking about. If, for instance, you might play a little part of a jazz piece, and then let's pay attention to the drummer. And normally when you would think of a drummer, it's like a doom tak doom tak. It's really like really fierce, playing on the one, and it's about the stability. But if you really listen to a good drummer, then he's listening very closely to what's emerging in a context, because jazz is a complex system. All kind of things are emerging and happening, and you're in the rhythm section, you're part of that, and you're playing with that. So sometimes you might give a little nudge, or disturb it a bit, or play with it, or say yeah, or I like this. And that means that you're listening in a generous way, very, very differently than when you are having just a task to keep the beat. So this playing with that, playing around with that, might be connected in science with something called ultrastability, what's happening in cybernetic systems. But well, that might be too abstract of a language to start with. So then you can even skip that whole thing and just try to express that, play with that, people listen to that, and then you might ask, what's your organization like? Are you playing in a steady beat? Or might you be interested in what a good jazz drummer is doing? Might you just leave out the one, for instance? Shut up for a second, so someone else might jump in and give it more of a balance of power that is more helpful to navigate complexity.
You bring up a great point about sort of encouraging people, leading them towards thinking in different ways and paying attention and noticing different kinds of things. Because I think a lot of times we do get into our habits, we do get into our patterned way of behaving, and we miss so much. And just one little shift, almost like a prism, right? One little shift of how you look at something opens up a whole other world of possibilities, as you were referencing, listening to the drummer in a different way.
And that makes me think also of, I mean, we went straight for transformation, which sounds a bit big and overwhelming and monolithic, but absolutely in just the conversations of a group or a team, it can be fascinating to just ask yourself, what's the sound of this group? What's the rhythm of it? You know, what's the melody? What's the harmony? You know, if we sense into our feelings and experiences of the team, is there a heaviness? Is there a lightness? You know, does one instrument dominate, to your point, Rick, around sort of balance in bands? You know, is someone talk all the time, and is that helpful or is it not helpful? Sort of just noticing without judgment. It's another lens, really, just to sort of experience what goes on in a team and ask some questions around it.
What does it mean when you bring the rhythm section into the conversation?
Yeah, that could open up a conversation around, you know, status. You know, who has status in the organization? Is it the shiny trumpets? You know, who are the shiny trumpets? You know, who's holding it together really behind the background?
Yeah, well, as you said, like bringing in the rhythm section also leads me to think about not only an individual organization, but in our world, what happens when organizations merge or one organization buys out another organization. And now you have two different organizations with different kinds of rhythms coming together, right? So how might you work with that when bringing two different types of sounds together, two different types of, or two different parts of a band or something like that?
It's about the same thing, I guess, when you just, there's an idea of you have players in a band, but metaphorically you might say we got players in a team, which is the band, but different teams work together as players in a bigger band, which might be the department, and the departments work together and players in the band organization. And so it's all about how does that jamming thing work, which is being really truly interested in what the other one's offering, playing around with that, not judging that, not having an overarching narrative up front or an idea up front, suspending your judgment, listening, playing with that, seeing what emerges. So then then a whole new band sound is emerging from players that were normally not playing together. A jazz band playing bebop and a player from Cuba coming in, a good jazz band, after that session is a bit a cubop band. They listen to the rhythm, they're interested, you know, and after the session they say, that was cool, we're not going to be a salsa band because you're way too good for that, you're way too salsa, but well, let's play with that, and then you get cubop. So everything is changing in a subtle way, but if you're not opening up to playing with all these subtle low sparks that are happening, then nothing would change at all. And one thing is a thing that I sometimes use as a metaphor, jamming to the bigger band. If you realize that we all organizations might be playing to the bigger band, which might be the harmony of the spheres, then you can start to talk about corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line. This is the bigger band. What do we need in nature? What do we need around social justice, around the things that really go to our hearts? And if you just take that as the sound of it all, you know, the cool sound for what's happening in the world, then we're all jamming to the bigger band, which might be anyone around the planet that might be wanted to be playing along.
Really cool stuff. Yeah.
And that rhythm also makes me think, it wasn't quite the situation you asked about there, Beth, but of thinking of organizations that are coming together in a merger and acquisition situation, and you know, share prices are offered and accepted or not accepted, and there's some kind of need for the rhythm to go on, and there's a huge temptation for everyone to stop playing any rhythm at all in that uncertain phase where people are trying to work out, okay, well, you know, which roles are going to continue? Have we got two solo trumpets now? How does that all pan out? And yeah, that lens of rhythm is an interesting one there. How do we keep enough of a rhythm going that the whole organizational entity doesn't dissipate and we lose everything that's been for sale or bought, whilst recognizing that it's a very uncertain time for people. So
yeah, that's so interesting, because I know that when I work with organizations on change, they almost stop. They stop communicating because they're waiting to make decisions. But in that space of no noise, right, in that space of no communication, people make up their own stories, which are usually much worse than the actual reality. Yep. So what else from your book or the work that you're doing do you want people to know? What else that I haven't mentioned or brought up that you think is really critical to your work and especially represented in the book?
Well, what comes to mind with me is I might go two ways answering this question. I might come up with examples that might be helpful in practical situations, like working in practice. That's one thing, and I think, well, if you listen to that, read into that, it might be inspiring. But what I think is more important is that the whole thing is meant to spark conversations about what you're doing. So it's not about the samples themselves. It's more like, okay, you can look at that and what does spark with you. It's not diagnostic, it's dialogic. So we just come up with something as an invitation to notice different things and talk about that. So in these conversations, you might come up with things that we cannot predict. I'm not an expert on what's happening in your organization. You are. So, but how do you get to all these slumbering creative ideas across silos that might emerge by sensing into it from a different perspective? So I would think that I would like to hand over to people. If you read into it like that, then you don't know exactly what the lessons are that we are offering from our practices, but more what lessons might you learn from yourself by engaging in a different type of conversations.
Yeah, I think it's very much, we wrestled with the process of sort of trying to capture our conversations and write them down in a linear form. Every fiber of our body wanted to rebel against this linear form, but I don't know another way to read things, so we had to kind of go with it in the end. But also there's something about writing a book down. It felt like there was a lot of pressure. I don't know if it was peer pressure, but this idea of it having to be definitive and summative. And spoiler alert, it's none of those things. It's open-ended, it's invitational, it's partial. On a different day, it would have been different. So that I guess again, the guiding spirit perhaps is that Batesonian feeling of let's just take different things and put them together and see what happens, and keep in that space of curiosity. Because even when we find something good, if we hold on for it for too long, if we turn it into too many nouns, as you said, Rick, then it's likely to trip us up later on because we stop being open to what's really going on and what might be helpful. So yeah.
Well, listen, thank you both so much for your time today and for putting this out into the universe, because it is great. And hopefully it sparks many conversations, as you've alluded to. And I hope that our conversation sparks other kinds of dialogues as well. So thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.